Welcome to this presentation on finding success factors in overcoming crisis. I'm Sean Elliott, and I'm working as the Director of Career and Experiential Learning at Redeemer University in Ancaster, Ontario. And in the past, I've worked as the former Regional Director of Central Canada of CWIL. I've been a former pastor, former administrator, and counselor in higher education and outreach centers, and likely, probably more important, I'm the father of two amazing daughters, three beautiful granddaughters, and my wife and I are actually going on to our 35th wedding anniversary this year, of which I have to say, folks, is an incredible miracle of the grace of God in action. So this presentation is actually part of a message that was provided to Safe Families on January 14th, 2026, and is intended to provide courageous inspiration to workers that are keen on supporting children, youth, and families in times of trauma, crisis, and neglect to overcome and to find a form of success. Imagine with me for a moment a young 13-year-old boy gets picked up from school at the end of the day by a children's aid worker to be taken to a foster home. They have a garbage bag with clothes and belongings in the car. Let's call him Charlie. But in this case, maybe you could be Charlie in our story. Imagine, will you, if you were in this situation? As Charlie arrives at the foster home, the family has already established their plans for the meal that night. They usher the young boy into the home, and after the children's aid social worker provides some details, the young boy is told to go find a room down the hall to put his bag down. So after a few minutes goes by, the young boy is then told that he will be given supper in another room. Apparently, this is the other room for the children that frequently come to the foster home. And on arrival to the room, Charlie has been given some supper, but as a result of the emotional turmoil, he doesn't really have much of an appetite. Would you feel like eating in this situation? Charlie wonders what's going to happen tonight. There's a lot of unknowns. He doesn't even know the town or the village he has been sent to. Why would this have happened? Could you imagine how you might feel? You're not in your home, you're not in your own bed, you don't even know where you are, you don't know who these people are, and you're not sure whether you can trust them at this point. When we investigate a little bit deeper, we actually find out that Charlie was sent to this foster home because on her way into school that morning, his sister told the bus driver about being hit with a steel rod by her stepfather. And so as a result, authorities called CAS, and I guess you could say the rest is history, but because Charlie was part of three children that had to be removed immediately, they were all sent to different homes. And this is often the case with siblings. There just isn't a home available that could handle three children in such short notice. And so each of the three children were put into custody in different homes. And so although Charlie is the oldest of the three, he doesn't know this. At this point, he wonders, what has he done wrong? Why has he been sent to this home with, again, another garbage bag? And why is he just one of the other kids that have to sit in the other room? So, as you think about this story, if you were Charlie, how would you feel? Would you feel like eating? Would you feel displaced, confused, or even feel like you've been part of the othering group? You see, Charlie doesn't know what he did wrong, and that's often how crisis feels. Now, crisis is a moment of intense difficulty when decisions actually feel impossible. The word of crisis actually originates from decision and difficulty. In other words, when people cannot or struggle in making a decision. Some have described it a crisis as an emergency, trauma, upheaval, distress. Maybe there are some words that might come to your mind as you think about some of the crisis that you've seen around. What words might you use in trying to describe what crisis really is? Some might even call it just you're in a jam, you're in a bind, it's hardship, it's a terrible situation, it might be hell on earth. How would you describe what you see when people are going through a crisis? Someone described their crisis as a big change, a scary or stressful event that suddenly changes how life feels. I mean, have you been there? Have you felt scared or stressed at some point in your life where suddenly it changes how life feels? Right? We've all experienced those kinds of feelings, and that's what crisis can feel like. So maybe we can relate to one another in times of crisis. It doesn't have to be a beating, a war, a car accident, or even being homeless. We can still relate to how crisis may feel. And so sometimes when we refer to the word, we think it's something other people are dealing with. But most of us think crisis happens to other people until it doesn't. Safe Families Canada's vision is a future where vulnerable children are not separated from their parents due to crisis, aiming to keep families together by preventing neglect and abuse. And while their mission is to create extended family like support systems through church based circles of support that offer temporary hosting, mentorship, and resources rooted in radical hospitality to provide love and stability to isolated families. And so this is why organizations like Safe Families matters. You see, what Safe Families does today is exactly what research tells us works. Why am I talking about this? Well, three reasons actually. Professionally, I've spent my career working with youth, families, and systems that often fail people in crisis. I've worked as a social services worker, a pastor, a youth center team leader, and an agency director. And these experiences demonstrated to me how crisis really robbed people of healthy lifestyles, supportive families, positive functioning, and especially access to education. Academically, my research focused on what helps former youth in care actually succeed. Actually, while completing one of my graduate programs, I decided to study underrepresented students, and more specifically, those who were coming out of foster care. And unfortunately, most of the literature was deficit focused, meaning that it was really looking at why former youth in care were failing and unable to overcome their trauma, their abuse, their neglect in the system, and their adversities. And then the third reason why I dive into this topic is personally, I also grew up in foster care. This is the most challenging motivator for me in looking at this topic because I had grown up with this experience. At 15, I emancipated from my biological parents and from CIS foster care, putting myself through high school and eventually post secondary education. And so, actually, it wasn't until my daughters were strong in their lives and my granddaughters were born that I didn't really start diving into these kinds of success factors. Maybe it was just that grandpa wanted to see if there were ways that he could pass on some of this to the next generations. I mean, the way that it was going for me when I was a child, it felt like if I didn't get some kind of help or if there wasn't a way out, my life was over. Can you imagine if Charlie arrived in your home? I mean, I arrived in a foster home after being beat so badly one time I couldn't talk, which actually is saying a lot about me now. I can't stop talking. Yet they're wondering, you know, they were wondering, why didn't I want to eat? Why didn't I want to talk or, even sleep? So, being affected personally, professionally, and academically by crisis, I decided to dive deeper into the research. Eventually, I published the first set of case studies in our nation on the success factors of former youth in care in the Canadian Journal of Higher Education. Folks, these were stories of many others. Actually, the Research Ethics Board restricted me from sharing my own story to prevent any biases being formed. And so all I could actually say was that I too have come from a foster care background. The formal title of the journal article was called Navigating Through Post-Secondary Education, Foster Care Alumni's Account of Factors Contributing to Their Successful Graduation. Now, my rationale in going forward with this kind of study was that I discovered that being a foster care alumni in my fourth post-secondary education program, I wanted to really learn from others. And what I found in my research was that actually less than 44% of former youth in care graduate from high school. So that's less than half. And out of that number, less than 5% of foster care alumni graduate from post-secondary education. I mean, so I'm asking, like, how come I had succeeded? And how come my younger brother and sister had succeeded? I also learned that trauma, neglect, and abuse are adverse conditions that foster youth carry into their long term future. And actually, many workers refer to this as the ACE, the adverse childhood experiences. And they actually will do scales in terms of trying to determine where they sit with their ACE factors and trying to help support them. I also learned that access to and the ability to succeed in post secondary education is drastically affected because of these kinds of factors, and that the research mostly focused on failure, not success. No evidence based research outcomes existed in demonstrating success in Ontario and then also in the nation. Did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete? Proving nature's wrong. It learned to walk without having feet. Funny, it seems, but by keeping its streams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else ever cared. Keeping all these dreams, proving nature's laws wrong, it learned how to walk without having feet. It came from concrete. It learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete. You see, you wouldn't ask why the rose grew from concrete, why it had damaged petals. On the contrary, we would all celebrate its tenacity. We would all love its will to reach the sun. Well, we are the rose. Now, that was a poem from Shakir, but it was actually eventually put into song by Tupac that symbolizes resilience and the ability to overcome adversity despite challenging circumstances. In the case studies that I conducted in this research, one of our candidates indicated that the path to college or university is very difficult because your priorities become almost survivalish. Like you want to figure out the instability, you want to feel safe. See, I was asking this question as it pertains to how an individual might consider some career pathways in the midst of the difficulties he was coming out of. And so Peter, in this case, says, you want to feel cared for. You start to forget about goals when there's just so much instability and trauma and, frankly, abuse in these situations. Although research literature pointed to many other things that included the need for financial supports, housing, and systematic changes, the participants that I worked with provided feedback on their factors of success in this multiple case study, indicating the following findings. There's 5 key points. First, caring, coaching adults. One trusted adult can change outcomes drastically. These could be teachers, foster parents, volunteers, church members. I mean, in my own life, God's providence led me to a strong Christian family who indicated that they had prayed for someone like me to come into their home. Knowing in the past that I was never part of a family and was kind of like the other kid who was paid for by the government CAS system. I mean, I couldn't figure out this motivation at first. I mean, they asked if I wanted to come into their home either as a boarder or as a son. I couldn't believe it. Eventually, their church ended up taking in my younger sister and brother through their relationships in the congregation. And this is what safe families workers do often. That was the number one success factor, where we see mentoring through caring, coaching adults. The second success factor was this thing called resistance. Not rebellion, but it was a resistance to refuse the label of becoming a statistic. Psychologists call this aspect resistance capital. It's a resistance to the negative stereotype of their biological parents. It's a resistance to the expectation of failure by others. It's a resistance to the stigma of insignificance and to the feeling of being othered, where you feel like you're just someone other than the rest. And so this was the second reason why participants felt they were able to succeed. They didn't accept the norm that was forecasted for foster kids, but resisted it to succeed. It's a form of turning away from a negative prospect that society expects. And many of the participants would say, come hell or high water, I was going to prove it, that I wouldn't be a statistic or a failure. There's a time in my own life when I died, and I felt like I died emotionally inside. I knew I had nothing to lose but to prove that I could do something different than the failure that I had been called. The third success factor was this thing called determination. I mean, we all think that, yeah, that, comes out in many things, but success in this case, especially with our case participants, was non-negotiable. There was no other option. They had to succeed, and they would persist despite the setbacks. Often reminded by their coaches, their mentors, and even caring adults. Former youth in care in our studies said that they knew that they had to do better. Despite the overwhelming trauma, the pain, and the adversity, they were determined to succeed, even when they had fallen back, as is often the case. What we see with foster care alumni, they will take longer to complete post-secondary education and will often have repeated attempts to even access it. But quitting was not an option. For an example, even myself, even though I couldn't get into university or college at the beginning, my determination helped me figure out how to get a legal affidavit to prove that I couldn't access my parents' tax returns to qualify for financial assistance. I mean, what 18-year-old knows how to get an affidavit, right? The fourth success factor is experience. And this is where we saw that exposure to post-secondary education, even in some small way, would change their self-belief that they could actually do it. And so this is where we see that experiential learning really does matter. Through field placements and an internship, myself, I learned ways to succeed in completing my education and tying it into career prospects. And most foster kids don't have parents or siblings, even in some cases, to run to for help, advice, or coaching about how to overcome some of the adversities in post-secondary education, either getting into it or even persisting through it. And so this lack of family connections puts them at a disadvantage. And really, we would also say a lack of privilege. The fifth factor, success factor that we saw in our studies was career clarity. Even a small amount of clarity about their career and where they were going to go could create incredible motivation. And this direction would then fuel as well their perseverance. So one participant described how the discouragement of a high school guidance teacher propelled them to dig deeper and to get more information. I mean, that negative aspect actually helped him to become more clear in his career pursuits. And so, with reduced amount of guidance and support, foster care alumni in our studies were able to demonstrate increased action. I mean, just a little bit drastically affected even my success and motivated me to a life of assisting others in discovering their careers and their callings in life. Folks, I just want to say, sport doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be present. What does the Bible say about the meaning of true religion? Well, pure and genuine religion in the sight of God, the Father, means caring for orphans and widows in their distress and refusing to let the world corrupt you. From James 1, verse 27. You see, faith isn't abstract, it shows up in who we choose to stand beside. See, we don't need to fix everything. You you do need, though, to listen, to notice, to connect. I mean, as my foster parents would sit up late at night asking me how I felt things were going, or would correct me about my anger while fighting a rock drill on a ladder. There's all kinds of situations. They just need someone to listen to. When you think about it, foster children who really are their guardians. It's the government. They can't go running to their government, right? So they need these kind of mentors. They need these coaching, caring adults to go running to listen. So, I want to encourage you to just be there, to check in with the children, the youth, the people that you are working with. And when you encounter things that you cannot answer, then partner with the staff, ask for help, but be consistent. You don't need to be a hero. You just have to be there. Imagine if someone had simply asked Charlie, "How are you really doing, Charlie?" For children and family in crisis, presence is often the beginning of hope. See, I was Charlie. That was my situation. And I know the difference it can be when someone is just there to listen and to ask, how are things really going? So thank you for your time, folks. If I can be of any further assistance, please feel free to check me out or some of the details or resources at my website, seanelliott.ca, or you can also email me at sean.elliott@redeemer.ca. Thank you, and God bless.